Big ideas start with a spark. At Tassis, we use that spark to ignite the fire in ourselves and our kids. So with the trust we build and the knowledge we share, we can grow together and stand tall, creating opportunities to advance in business while setting an example for the next generation. Whether you are starting fresh in Portugal or expanding globally, we're here to support each other. This is more than a network. We are a community that sets the examples for the leaders of tomorrow.
Which we're going to discuss how things look like right now in terms of geopolitics and looking at technology as a geopolitical asset. Then we're going to put regulation on top of it, and then we're going to discuss how do we actually position and how do we behave towards that. So I'm assuming that Mark Carney's speech 10 days ago at Davos was pretty much saw by everyone. And something was established very clearly, things are changing, and what we thought was our greatest advantage, which was being interconnected, is now being weaponized. This implies a lot for the world of technology, regardless of us realizing that or not. That means that everything that we've integrated so far can work pro or against us. And that has implications on how society behaves and how people like myself who build technology need to think about what we're building as well. Given the connectivity and given that everything that we've been building is fully integrated by everyone, this exposes us not only from an economic standpoint, but also from a geopolitical standpoint. And we're seeing that happening right now in Europe, when Europe starts moving assets that were shared, for instance, with the United States towards Europe alone. The company I work for was recently contacted by an entity from a sovereign government in Europe. One of their leading demands is that the cloud that is used is fully European, not just hosted in Europe, fully European. This means that technology has been started to position itself geopolitically as well, becoming aware of this now as the world changes. So, as Carney said, much more eloquently than me, the old order is not going to come back. So we need to start positioning towards the new world. That implies also changing how we think about connectivity. This doesn't mean that we stop being connected with other countries or that we just break our diplomatic and technological connections. This means building independence before interconnection. How do we look at it from a Portuguese standpoint? Portugal is small. We're not particularly relevant economically, not even in Europe. I would consider us a microstate, not even a small state. And on average, we take quite longer to pick up on others' trends in Portugal than anywhere else in Europe. That is seen across economy, across politics, across technology as well. So how do we position? The majority of people are not aware that this question was put in Portugal back in the 60s when we were facing colonial war. The United States smartly identified that Portugal, despite small, could be an interesting asset due to our geopolitical position, due to our geography, and also due to our diplomatic history. So we're connected basically with everyone. And back in the day, the United States proposed to Portugal in 1963 that they would give economical support to Portugal if only we decided to provide independence to the then colonies. And Portugal was arrogant enough not to know how to read the room. And the predictions that the CIA then wrote in the reports about what was going to happen economically and politically in Portugal came true. They're eerily accurate, and they are eerily accurate until the 80s. So not only we lost the colonial war, which was expected, but also the economic downsides of that were exactly as predicted. So how does a small state is this relevant towards a country like the United States back in the day becomes relevant? Well, it has to do with our position, but also with our geography. And we still have that position and that geography. We keep the same diplomatic ties, we keep the same economic ties, we keep the same position. So how do we leverage that now in order not to repeat the same mistake that we did in the 60s? So this brings me to the context of what value do we have and how we need to look at the reality right now. So as Andres spoke better than me, we need to look into infrastructure. In our opinion, infrastructure for a Portuguese, from a Portuguese standpoint, and for a state like Portugal, means creating intelligence. And intelligence understood in the modern type. So data, Microsoft and NVIDIA are building the capacity for us to have compute and data and power like we never had before with the investment that they're doing towards the AI factories in Sines. Energy, we're not the best country for that, but we do have an experience on sustainable energy, and that is an asset that we can use because that is going to fuel the compute and the data, which then brings me to the two last pillars of intelligence: standards and decision systems. Standards here need to be understood in a broader context. So we're talking about regulation and quality standards on technology. And this is relevant because there is a gap between understanding on what regulation means for different countries. So for instance, in the United States, which are not rule-based or law-based in terms of regulating technology, they're standard-based, that means innovation first, regulate later, and regulate in a much smoother way than we do in Europe. In Europe, that means rules first. And the world is more or less divided. There's pretty much four approaches to this. So United States, closely followed by China, believe it or not, have more or less the same position. The major difference is that China understands scale much better and uses the regulation to harvest the results of innovation towards state assets. And then there's the European positioning that is closely followed by Canada as well. Canada was one of the first countries to regulate AI towards something called the Bill C-27, which is somewhat in the middle between the current European regulation and no regulation at all from the United States. And then the other states closely follow. And then there's Singapore's approach, which is pretty pragmatic and sets standards as well. So when we understand standards, we're looking at standards from this open context. And then decision systems, which implies something even more relevant than regulation, which is governance. And this is what we need to start focusing on. When we start thinking about an orchestrator state, we need to think, how do we make these pillars work together? And how do we make them work towards sovereignty? So it means aligning systems, and aligning systems means creating the relevant regulatory bridges between the approaches of the different countries. It means also coordinating the different actors. Right now, for instance, there's work groups in Europe that are focusing on how to implement technology and to anticipate the effects of regulation coming into force. One of them is called the AI Pact. These are actors that sit and discuss how pragmatically things are going to move onward with the application of technology. Coordinating actors also means being able to sit amongst them and understand how the different perspectives work. Portugal is in a perfect position for that. We will need to adopt the regulation from Europe because it's mandatory, but we can also organize towards the standards from the United States. And that would allow our companies also to compete better in a world environment instead of just focusing on what's happening in Europe. That also means that we have the ability of having a practical, thought-defining voice in these forums. And that's something that is kind of shy still, but we're getting there. I can share a couple of insights on that too. And that means building intelligence, not just becoming a landlord state, which is probably the most likely scenario from what's happening nowadays in Portugal. Thinking about governance, which is the decision systems. So when we think about regulation and when we think about technology and compliance in general, we think about something that we do post factum. So something happens and our main concern is, how do we demonstrate compliance, or how do we demonstrate that we're actually following the rules? Completely wrong thought for AI. This kind of mental space implies that the technology is stable, but stable as in it moves to a predictable rhythm. That doesn't happen with AI. AI doesn't move at a predictable rhythm. AI is by nature dynamic. So we cannot look at governance or compliance or regulation as a post factum because it will not work. We need to approach it from a governance standpoint. How do we make non-compliance impossible? And that implies building systems that go way beyond just oversight. That means moving from compliance, which is typically something for legal people like me, and moving it into the systems in a combo between engineering and actual legal people and creating that bridge. Same kind of thought for everything I'm saying. So we need to build bridges and to have a systemic view of the technology in order for it to become a geopolitical asset. Same thing, different mindset. And this is the relevance of governance. So if we don't adopt a governance approach, be it in the system from a micro perspective towards the state in a macro perspective, we will have a lot of assets, but we will have no agency. And if a country doesn't have agency, it's just a follower and has to put up with whatever it is served. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. When we think about governance and regulation, we also need to change our mindset towards it. Usually, the binomial approach is either we innovate or we regulate. And in our opinion, that could be more false. The two things are not mutually exclusive. Regulation and standards and governance can pretty much be a way to empower technology, as long as we see it from a systemic point of view. It also builds trust, and trust fuels more development, and development means more adoption. With AI, one of the problems is trust. So if we invest in looking into governance as an asset towards innovation development, we will be able to reestablish trust. I was listening to the previous talks, and one of the students said something very interesting about the way AI has been using in some countries. That clearly seems like going into the fundamental rights kind of field. In Europe, that is a question that is being taken very seriously. I have the fortunate chance to sit at one of the advisory boards in Brussels, in the European AI office. And one of the things the European Commission has done is calling experts from all fields of society to determine how we should look into high-risk uses and what that actually means in practice. So for instance, in Europe, we couldn't use a tool to segment behavior based on ethnicity. That's absolutely forbidden. We also can't use technology to replace any human reasoning towards something that might be impactful on human rights. So there's a bunch of work done. Unfortunately, it is somewhat a closed group. So the last working session we were on, we were very fortunate to be called in as experts because we got to speak in the commission alongside with OpenAI and Cohere, and we're like the smallest company, and let's look at it from a solar system kind of approach. So if OpenAI is the sun and Cohere would be Jupiter, we're not even a planet. We're like the tiniest droplet of space junk that is floating around. So for us as a company, it was an immense privilege to have a voice in that forum. And we did so because, well, our approach has to do with looking at regulation as a source of opportunity instead of as an ordeal. That's something that avoids or prevents innovation from happening. This also protects sovereignty, which for someone like me, designing tools for big enterprises and for governments, this is very relevant. I cannot deploy a solution in a government like we've done, for instance, in the Portuguese Ministry of Justice or in the hospitals without having in mind that security and regulation are paramount. So that leaves us into what's going to happen next. So AI Act goes into full force August next year. There's a ramp up of parts of the regulation that are going to be put in place. Portugal adopted the digital strategy, which is mostly focused inward still, like building capacity for the government itself, not very externally focused. The next step is actually building upon that and positioning as something that can be used as a geopolitical asset. The problem is governments take too long to adapt to what's happening in reality. And that's natural. Governments have to deal with risk for society, and society sets the pace. So what is our role in all of that? How do we as society have to position towards this movement? And how do we become part of orchestrating value for Portugal or for any other country of the same size and position in comparison to what's happening in the world? So several steps towards society. I believe change needs to come from the bottom up instead of the opposite way. The movement is being done also from the governments and the European Union and the United States and the bigger bodies and institutions, but we also need to do our part, so bottom up. First of all, we need to start chasing hype as investors. Things that are now very valuable AI-wise are not necessarily the things that build capability. AI is a pretty cool tool. We can do basically anything with it. But that doesn't mean that everything harvests value, and we need to start thinking long-term. It takes time to build something with credibility and security. We took 6 years to build the minimal fraction of the solution that we deploy right now. It's not even ready yet. And I would be lying if I told you that we could do it faster. We cannot. If we're responsible about what we're building, security needs to be in there. It takes time to test the systems. It takes time to look into what actually harvests risk. And risk is far from being just data and models. It's systemic. That also means that companies need to stop testing things, the never-ending pilot movement. We do pilots for this and that, and the actual return on investment of those pilots is not measured. We need to start measuring what this implies. That is good for the companies, the investors, and the builders also. We need input, but we also need feedback. For people like me that have companies that are building solutions, that means also focusing on value. It is pretty cool to build something that is going to be next used by a big company and that does cool things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, again, is useful, then that is sustainable. The less sexier applications are the ones that usually bring the most value. The thing we have in the hospitals in Portugal, in the intensive care units, not sexy at all. No one cares about what we're doing, but it's useful. It allows doctors to have a full view of what happens in the patients and to have tools that enable them to improve standard of care. That is relevant, but it's totally not sexy. For schools and parents, that means focusing on systems. This is the least of my concerns in this forum. Everyone I've heard, everyone I've met here already thinks system instead of tool. And the students have an unusually high level of maturity and critical thinking towards what needs to be done with the technology. But it also means that I have to deliver a message to the students. I don't think that the steps that you're giving towards university, as one of the students was mentioning, is going to be determinant on what you're going to do next in the future. I started studying biochemistry, then I moved to engineering. I graded in engineering, then I studied law. I work in technology. My degree does not define what I do. It enables me to think critically. And that is what we need to be able to use the technology, not necessarily the degree. The degree gives us ways of thinking, frames of thinking. That's just it. And the greatest goal of it all is, I'm also an optimist. I think technology is here to serve us. It's not here to be a ordeal. And if it's here to serve us, and if it's here to enhance human capacity, we need to think about it as a tool, not the end game. And because of that, systems thinking is the best approach, be it in governments, geopolitically, in companies, or in schools. We need to remember that in the end of the day, if technology is becoming a problem, then we need to change our approach to it. Thank you very much.